Welcome. I'd like to discuss reliability and validity with you. These are important ideas that help us connect the operationalization of concepts to the actual research that we're going to do, and it allows us to know if we can count on the results. Now, reliability refers to consistency. It means that every time we take a measurement, or every time we conduct a particular type of analysis, we get the same result when we have the same phenomenon that we are looking at. So, for instance, if I'm using a scale to measure weight, and every time it added 30 pounds to my weight, that would be a reliable form of measurement, even though it's incorrect, because it was consistent. It's consistently adding 30 pounds. If I were aware that it was adding that 30 pounds over, I could subtract those 30 pounds and I would have my correct weight. So the key idea here is stability, predictability, consistency. When we look at validity, we're talking about accuracy. We want to know how accurate is a particular measurement. Does it capture the sociological concept that we are looking at? Does it do what we expect it to do? And we'll see that there's a lot of sub-concepts, if you will, or parts or aspects of validity that you'll get to as you go through this entire presentation and you read through the chapter. But the general idea is that it refers to measuring what's supposed to be measured. And that's the fundamental idea of validity. So, for instance, if your scale is there to measure weight and you're not trying to use the scale in your bathroom to measure the distance between here and New York, well, it's a valid measurement for weight. It's just not a valid measurement for distance. The same thing for the many techniques we have in our toolbox to measure social phenomena. So if you can think of the Likert scale and questions that use the Likert scale, that can be a very good way to measure social attitudes, but it might not be a very good way to measure inequality. For that, we need a different kind of data. And it could be a good way to measure some phenomena. It might not be a good way to measure others. Usually it's the question that's going to be seen as either reliable or valid. So you can imagine you're administering a survey. If you get consistent results with the survey question, then that would show reliability. If it's actually capturing and measuring what you're supposed to measure and not something else, then that's part of validity. So, we can say that if a variable is poorly organized, or if that operationalization doesn't capture central aspects of the concept, then it might not be a valid measure, but it could be reliable. So, for example, federal poverty guidelines are reliable, but they really don't capture what it means to be poor. They sometimes, generally, are drawn far too low. I mean, there's a large consensus among social scientists that the federal poverty guidelines are about half of what they should be if we're talking about any kind of concept of what it means to be poor in the United States. And even that is probably being generous, because it's really difficult to get by on less than, say, 50,000 or 60,000 in many American cities. Also, we know that for this concept to work, we need a different standard in different places in terms of dollar amounts, because we have variance in the cost of living and variance in purchasing power. So, keep in mind that reliability and validity are independent of each other. We want them to go together. They often do, but you can have situations where you have high reliability, low validity, low reliability, low validity, low reliability, high validity, or you could be high in both, which would be optimal. What happens, sometimes there are trade-offs. So you can capture multiple dimensions of a concept, but with each new dimension that you capture, it might be more difficult to get the measurement to be the same every time. And thus comparability over time could be reduced and so forth. And that can affect reliability. Also, it's important to realize that these concepts are different whether we're talking about quantitative or qualitative research. Generally, we think about the concept in quantitative research, and so if we talk about validity, we think about it the way we've presented it thus far. You're measuring what's supposed to be measured, you get the same numerical value for each measurement. But when you're talking about qualitative research, we really are asking a different question. Are you capturing the views of the people that you're interviewing or that you're observing through participant observation? Are you really capturing their lived experience? If you do, then that increases the credibility of the research. So sometimes they'll call that credibility as opposed to validity, but that's the idea of validity in qualitative research. Reliability here also means that you're getting similar results for similar settings as opposed to the same results or very similar results in a variety of settings, as you would expect in quantitative research. And they sometimes refer to that as dependability. So how do you promote this? Fundamentally, when you want to promote reliability in your research. So to do that, you need to have very clearly defined your concept. You've got to go through the conceptualization and operationalization phases of the research seriously and very carefully. And so once you do that, you are a long way on the road to having reliable results. So ensure that the variables are operationalized in such a way that'll be useful for comparison purposes when different individuals collect the data or conduct research. That way, you know that the results are comparable. You're comparing apples and apples and not apples to oranges. Or in terms of gathering data, that means having clear and explicit instructions of what, when, and how the data is gathered and how the data is to be understood. So that the whole point of this is to remove ambiguities. What is counted, what isn't counted. Sounds not very exciting, but for instance, when I was working on my dissertation, I was looking at data, was gathering data from Cuba and using their National Statistical Service. It was secondary data analysis, and I needed to see how many physicians there were in each municipality or in province. And so when I was looking at that, I noticed that sometimes they would count the physicians who were serving abroad on international missions, and sometimes they wouldn't. And it became really unclear to me as to if those physicians that were serving abroad were being counted or not being counted. And that was a question that I had. So if you can think about that, you just see, all right, well, what is that going to do to the quality of the data? So what can you really learn from the data that you're gathering if you're unsure of what's counted? You need to know exactly what it is that counts. And the reason for the ambiguity in that particular case, it was likely because people were still receiving their checks. Cuban physicians, even when they're on international missions abroad, continue to receive their salary at home in addition to an international stipend. But they're not there to serve that population while they're at home because they're abroad. So it was something that I wanted to know from my research. So remember also that there are different ways to conceptualize and operationalize sociological concepts such as class. If we could look at it, for example, as who owns the means of production and who doesn't, we could divide it on a simple income gradation. Those are two different ways of looking at class. Are they comparable? Would they lead you to the same results? So Generally, they may correlate if you think of people who own most of the major shares in major corporations. We know they're upper class, but does that really, is that the same as a division that's based on just simply income? Do we miss something there? Are they going to be comparable? So we need to know how people are operationalizing their data to know how reliable things are and if they're going to get the same results. So how can we measure reliability? An important idea here is this thing called composite variables. With composite variables, these are variables that are composed of many different variables in a survey or a questionnaire, and then those scores are either averaged or added up, depending on if it's going to be an index, which would be a summation of those variables, or a scale, which is an average of those values, and that gives you a composite score. So you could have, say, 20 questions to measure social cohesion, if you will, and maybe no one question captures the entire concept. So that's why you have more questions, because you want to increase your validity. But with each of those questions, then you're going to say, all right, we're going to make a value of this composite score. And so how do we do that? Well, those scores on each of those questions should correlate with each other pretty highly. And that's calculated by something we call Cronbach's alpha. And so that assesses the internal reliability of composite variables, which refers to the degree to which composite variables lead to consistent responses and therefore are tapping into the same idea or the same concept. So generally, you're going to want a score of, I believe, over 0.8 is really good. A 0.75, I believe, is the minimum. You want a high Cronbach's alpha. So high internal reliability indicates that one item in the chain is conceptually related. Conceptual related variables are influencing each other, and they should correlate. If they don't, you're capturing something different, and it's not part of the same concept that you're capturing in the composite variable. So here we have the critical values. You don't want something below 0.6. Over 0.7 is good. Above 0.8 is really ideal and excellent. So there we are. Some ideas about reliability.